Well, hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. We are back for lecture number 4, and I welcome you back to this lecture on the course History and Theology of Mission. Well, we've gone through a lot in the past few days, past 3 lectures. We've covered a lot of grounds. We have looked at mostly theological issues and theological foundations of mission. And today, and in this lecture and in the following lecture to this, we will look at more historical information. So we will look more of the stories, and we will go all the way back to first century. And even though I said that the first instance of mission that we notice is by God Himself, God being the missionary God, the one who sends, the one who blesses, the one who reaches out. Although I said that, my focus will be from the time of Jesus and onward from there, specifically looking at how the church has been involved in mission, how the church have done activities of mission over the 2,000 years of its existence, and how that has been reflected in different parts of the world. As you can see from my slide here, the focus for my lecture is going to be on Asia. That is the area that I am from, first of all, and it's the area that I'm the most comfortable with. And so please excuse me for focusing on Asia. But I think also it might be a good learning process for you too. I'm not sure how much you know about Asia and the history of Asia, especially the history of mission in Asia. But I think you might enjoy learning something new about a different continent. Some of you may have had the chance to go to Asia or to some of the Asian countries, or indeed to have friends or people that you know who are from this part of the world. And yet it may also be the case that you may not know much about the context of Asia. To be honest, I don't know much about Africa, so I will refrain from talking too much about Africa, about the continent that you all know much better about. So this is what I want to ask you to do as I talk about Asia and as I cover some of the themes and the stories from Asia. I would like you also to reflect from your own perspective as you learn about Asia. Reflect from your own perspective from Africa, and yeah, just reflect in your own mind. And when I give you a chance to chat with your friends as well, to think about how these things are, how they might be parallels in your own context as well. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through. And I think the one of the wonderful things about learning something new about another people's context, another the experiences of other people, is that it helps us to also reflect about our own context. So hopefully, even though I'll be talking about Asia, you will find this as a good opportunity to think about your own context and your own histories as well. So just a quick summary about the way that we will frame and the way we will structure today's lecture. First of all, we will go on a very microscopic level, and we will look at a very specific ethnic group, and that the group is my tribe, the ethnic group, the Rongmei Nagas, that I have mentioned to you in the first lecture. I want to talk about the history of Christianity among my people group, and if some of you, I guess that I could guess that some of you would be from ethnic groups as well, maybe tribes, or maybe different language groups, different geographical settings. You might find some of the stories that I share to be quite similar to you too. I'm currently reading a book about Christianity and mission. This is the book. It's called World Christianity and Indigenous Experience, and a big part of that book covers Africa. So there's discussion on Congo. There's discussion on East Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, Then there's a discussion on Catholicism, the Catholics' missions in Africa, in Sierra Leone, in uh, African diaspora in UK and in West Indies, in North America. There's also a section on um, yeah on East Africa, Buganda, West Africa, Nigeria, about the Yoruba people, and a bit of something about Uganda as well. So I'm really enjoying learning about your part of the world as well, and the history of mission in your part of the world. Uh, but I will not deal so much on that part of the history because firstly, I'm not the expert on that. You guys, you all are probably more equipped and more have more expertise to talk about that. So, if you would like to bring that up in the discussion, tell me something interesting that you find paralleled in your context. Please do so. Take note of that. I would love to hear those kinds of stories, especially from if you belong to a small minority or ethnic community and have similar experiences. I would love to hear those stories. So please keep that in mind. And so my point in saying all of that is that even though I'm talking about Asia, hopefully first of all it will be a good learning experience for you. You learn something new, but also I want you to think about your own history, your own context. Okay, so yes, first of all, my focus will be on a very small ethnic group in northeast part of India. The second part of the lecture would deal with what I'm calling the trade, colonialism, and technology, and these are three how do you call it? Three aspects in which mission activities were intimately tied together. So mission and trade, right? The flow of markets, the flow of goods and consumerism, all of that stuff. The mission and colonialism, right? And another important, very controversial, very problematic, and important entanglements of colonialism and mission. That's part of history as well. And technology, right? Technology has, especially in recent 40, 50, or 100 years, how technology has opened up this new opportunities and new challenges to mission, right? So I want to talk about these three things, and then I want to close off today's lecture with some theological reflections on missions, especially from the perspective of Asia. So that is the structure that I have in my mind for today's lecture, and uh, we'll start from a very narrow microscopic perspective, and we will look at a bigger picture of the whole of Asia, small location, locality, big continent of Asia, and then theological reflections. Okay, so I think I hope that mm, brief summary or brief foretaste of the structure of the lecture makes sense for you. Okay, all right, let's keep moving. So yes, I've shown you this a bit of this map, as you know, and as I've indicated earlier, this is the map of India. And first of all, you can tell that India is quite diverse. When you, for example, see me, right? You can tell that India has so many types, so many different kinds of people, different or different ethnic groups. Sorry, and different communities. Uh, Myself, I belong to, as I mentioned, I belong to a community called the Nagas, Nagas, and within the Nagas there are separate tribes. Okay, so um, I am called, I'm part of the tribe called Rongmei Nagas. There are about 25 plus tribes within the Naga community, and each of us have our own different languages. So that is how complex the cultural landscape is. Very diverse, and I think if you follow the red mark here on the map, the Naga people occupy all of this. Hang on, I'll use a pen instead. Um, the Naga people occupy all of these areas. So it's a pretty big area that the Nagas occupy. These are all, most of these places are hilly areas, and they're quite terraneous, very hard to access, very hard. I think I mentioned this in the previous lecture as well. Very hard to make roads, and so the roads are not in the best conditions. Um, but this is where we live, and as you might see, this is out here is Myanmar. So some of the Naga communities are also in Myanmar. They are the Naga communities. The Naga tribes are scattered across these three states: Assam, Nagaland, and Manipur. So these are the states of India. They are scattered all over like this in different places. Most of them are concentrated in this area, in this state, but substantial presence in the other three states as well. So just to give you a context of how diverse the northeast area. The northeast area is this whole area here. It's called the northeast region, the northeast India. Just to show you how diverse it is. This state, Meghalaya, have their own majority of 3 tribes that have completely different languages. Um, they are distinct in their culture, in their narratives, in their history. 3 major tribes. There are other smaller communities as well, but the major tribes are 3 of them. And again, as I say, very distinct, very different tribes. In Assam, there are also numerous tribes. These are mainly plain area, not hilly, but plain. And there are numerous tribes here as well. So if you go here, there's different tribes. If you go here, obviously there's different tribes. There's different tribes here. There's Karbi. So, and these are all distinct. They have their own distinct culture, their own distinct history and narratives. And yeah, it's incredibly complex part of the world. If you go to the state Manipur, and if you go down here, there's other tribes like the Kuki, the Mizo people are here. They again here there's primarily one big tribe, but under the tribe they've got many other communities that have distinct stories and distinct identities. These are all separate. You can imagine all broken up like this into different communities, each with their distinct languages, distinct cultures, distinct to the extent that we cannot understand each other. You know what I mean? Um, People used to say that, say, English and what other languages? English and let's say Latin, or sorry, Italian. Um, they're different languages. Yes, they're quite different, but somehow there are some similarities, right? We're talking about these small languages that are distinct and as separate as you can ever get. Like if German and English are distinct, these small tribes, these small languages are equally distinct. You know what I'm trying to say? They are equally diverse. In fact, I would say some of them are even more distinct. There's no root, there's no similarities in the root. You cannot trace any similar words, similar structures of sentences. They're all wildly distinct and separate from one another. If you go up to Arunachal Pradesh, this is China. Let me try to write with a mouse. This is China, and again here we've got different communities as well with different languages. In Assam here, different languages. So you can tell that this is incredibly complex, incredibly culturally this diverse part of the world. And I understand that is the case as well in Africa. There are many distinct languages, distinct people groups, and distinct tribes, right? So I think that you can understand the kind of landscape, what's going on here. Now, Myanmar as well. Let me put Myanmar, MY here. There are also distinct minorities, ethnic minorities as well. So I'm trying to highlight how complex the landscape is and how there are different types of ethnic groups and ethnic identities in this place. Okay, so so this is what happened in the history of mission in the late 1800s. Okay, 1800s. if you remember, if you know something about the history of India, India was colonized by the British, and they were very important centers here. If you look here, and this is somewhere here. This is Calcutta. You might have heard of that place. The important places, location in this place here in Guwahati, in Shillong, and just so that you understand the context. Let me. This whole area here. Sorry, the map is getting very messy, but the whole area here. This a plain area, low lying plain area, right? Plain areas are easier to manage, easier to set up offices, and easier for administrative kind of control. So the British Empire, that controlled the Indian colony, the colonies in India, were settled mainly in the plains here. The offices were here. The plains were where roads were easy to construct, railways were easy to construct. So they were mostly here in the plain area, in the yellow mark, right? In the late 1800s, that was when the first missionaries came to this area in northeast India. Now, late 1800s, the first missionaries came to this area in Imphal. Okay, sorry, this is quite detailed, but I hope you will follow along to what I'm saying here. So the first missionaries came to Imphal here in the late 1800s. Again, this area is plain. These are all hills. These are plain. Now, when they came to Imphal, um, in the plains, they were the people were how shall I put it? The people were there was um, pr- princely states, right? Princely states. There was a proper system of governance. There's a monarch. There's a king. There's a prince, and all these plains were where there were uh, uh, a culture, a civilization. Now, when the British came to India and when they came and explored all these places, they were impressed with the civilizations. Okay, take note of this. This is quite important. They were impressed with the civilization. They were impressed with all the culture that the princely states had. So there was a king. They had traditional dances. They had traditional dresses. They had their own literature. They had their own written script. Their own proper language, like proper formal languages. And so when the missionaries came to northeast India in this area, they wanted to evangelize the civilized people. You know what I'm trying to say? They were interested in evangelizing the civilized people because they believed that the civilized people were important to evangelize because they had empire, they had the princely state, they had the government, right? So the civilizations, empires, they were here in the plain. Remember this mark, the yellow mark here. They were in the plains. They were here in Manipur, and they were also here in Myanmar. Okay, so the missionaries came to this place, Guwahati, Imphal, and their eyes were, most importantly, their eyes were on the plains. They wanted to evangelize the civilized people on the plains. They wanted to evangelize the civilized peoples in Manipur, in Myanmar, and they came to Imphal and they start setting up these missions, trying to evangelize this so-called civilized people, like people with culture. On the other hand, the people on the hills, tribal people, the tribes, they were called naked. They were called barbarians. They were like they're out in the jungles, and they didn't really consider much about them. In fact, it was hard to get to their place, to their villages, because, like I said, it was full of trees and forests, and they didn't have the energy or the money to invest to go into the hills. Rather, they were looking at the plains where there were already roads, there were already culture. They wanted to evangelize to them. The sad story is that the people in the plains, they were not interested. Many of them were practitioners of religions like Hinduism, a variant of Hinduism. They're practicing Buddhism. They were practicing, yeah. So they already had an established religious system, and they were not very impressed with missionary evangelism. They were not impressed at all. This is the same in different parts of India. So in India, even though the missionaries work so hard, you might have heard of people like William Carey. William Carey is quite well known. He is often known as the father of modern mission. William Carey was active in this area here. Let me mark that with a double circle in Calcutta. His center was here in West Bengal. He worked there for many years, and other missionaries also came and worked for many years. They didn't have much. They didn't have much success in the plains because they already had their own systems. They already were. They viewed the missionaries and the British as colonizers, and they were not interested. All this time, they somewhat ignored the hill people here, my people, the tribal people in the Nagas and in other tribals as well. But when the missionaries saw that they were not making any success with the plains people, they started to cast their eyes to the hills and started getting interested in evangelizing the hills people. Okay, so they started, and then what? Can you guess what happened? There was huge success among the tribal people. 1920s was the first time that missionaries, that the convert from my tribe, Rongmei Nagas, 1920, 1920s were the first time that the converts, they had converts from my tribe, my community. Today is what, almost 100 years of that, from that time, and as I mentioned, we are 80% Christians. So the rate of success among the tribal people has been much more than in other places. We can ask why that happened. There's so many factors. There's so many things that people have said, but the fact is that Christianity has been very successful in certain parts of the hills. Also, I must say that 1920s, right? If sorry, I don't have it in slide, but try to visualize with me. 1920s was where the first converts were starting to show up among the Rongmei Naga people. You remember in 1947 was when the British were kicked out of India. So basically, they had only 20 years something of missionary activity in their place. Only 20 years in which they engaged with missionaries and missionaries taught them. And even in the 20 years, like I said, the hills were so difficult to go to, right? The roads, there were no proper roads. The forest was so intense. Rains were heavy. So it was hard for missionaries to go to these places. So most of the work that were done, even in the 20 years before independence, 1920s to 1947, most of them were done by native converts, indigenous converts, indigenous evangelists who worked so hard to reach out to their own communities. And of course, after the British left in 1947, the responsibility for evangelizing was entirely on the indigenous converts. So I must say that I must add that Christianity grew to 88% today, but the main credit of the work, the main credit of preaching the gospel, telling the gospel, sharing the gospel, main responsibility was carried by the indigenous converts themselves. So in my context, in my story, the missionaries had very minimal role in the way that Christianity spread. It was the indigenous activities of the indigenous converts that were substantial in bringing the gospel to the people. So that's a bit of the story of my people, and I must also say that the missionaries who came to Imphal in 1800, late 1800s, as I mentioned, they were mostly Baptist, American Baptist, and so the theology has influenced subsequent converts and Christianities in our area, and that's why we are many of the Naga tribal people are mostly Baptist. Okay, so that's an important part of the history of my own ethnic group. I want to just emphasize again, before Christianity came, the people in the plains, the so-called civilized people. Okay, I hope you understand, and I hope you're getting some of the some of my the themes that I'm pushing forward here, which is the view that certain peoples are more civilized and certain people are less civilized. People used to People in the plains. If you see this yellow mark here, right, and the blue mark here in the yellow mark here and the blue mark here. People in the plains used to look down on people in the hills, and they would think that these people are uncivilized. They were barbarians. They were naked. They don't know how to dress properly. They don't have culture, and so that kind of discriminatory, that kind of prejudice, uh, the tribal people lived through those kind of experiences, and it's not a pleasant history for sure. But I'm sharing this because it's an important part of the story, and and yet it was the tribal peoples who received the gospel, because the gospel, in comparison to all those prejudices, the gospel gives them dignity, telling them that you, they are made in God's image. They are children of God, right? They are equal. Everyone is equal in the eyes of God. So ultimately, those rhetoric, those uh, prejudices of barbarianism and being civilized, all of that um, backfired in a way, right? So so yeah, here's a quick lesson for missions in the history of mission. The missionaries, the Western missionaries, were interested only in the civilized people, the people with culture, the people with influence, the people who were in empire. It seems like God is upsetting those expectations, and uh, and it was, at the end of the day, it was the tribal people, the hills people, who accepted the gospel. And there's something of a lesson for us there, isn't it? That we cannot predict how the gospel will be received. We cannot force how the gospel will be received, and we should not look down on people, because you don't know where God is going to move and where God is going to bring fruits from the activities, right? So that's I think that's an important lesson from this history of the Rongmei Nagas. So yeah, okay. So I want to give you some time to just reflect on that. Maybe you have your own stories from your own context. If you do, again, I would love for you to talk about that among your circle. So I've covered a lot of things: the experience of the tribal people, the experience of mission. Also, very importantly, the roles of indigenous converts in propagating the gospel and in missions. So I wanted to talk about all these themes, and if there's any similar stories in your context, I wanted to discuss with you. Maybe you all are from the same community, you all had the same stories. Regardless, I wanted to reflect on those stories and those histories, and you take some time to think about how the gospel came to your communities, what happened, was there a power dynamic between civilized and intelligent and cultured people versus quote unquote barbaric, and how God upsets those kinds of prejudice and teach us through missions, the fruits of mission, to be humble and to, yeah, to regard everybody as equals, right? So I wanted to talk about that, and also very importantly about indigenous converts, the role of indigenous converts, indigenous evangelists in the yeah, in the story of Christianity in your community. So can you talk about that for? I'll give you that's a substantial bit of conversation. I'll give you 10 minutes, and then we'll continue on with our lesson. Okay, so 10 minutes to talk about that, and then we'll continue. We'll look at the history of Asia and history of Christianity in a wider Asian context. Okay, all right. Well, let's get back to the lecture then. So in the second section, in the first section, as you see in the structure here, it was a biography of an ethnic group, how Christianity came to our community. I will also reflect more on it later as I talk about in the third section. I will talk a bit about some more detailed some of the implications of how indigenous leadership, indigenous converts were important in their roles in the history of Christianity in our community. But I've given you a very brief overview of the history of Christianity in our among our ethnic group. Now we will completely zoom out and have a broader bird's eye view of the history of mission in Asia. And of course, obviously, you can go and study this in so many ways. Like in Asia, if you just look at the map as well, Asia is such a huge continent. It's the most populous continent among all the other continents as well. And so you can do this study in any angle, in any way. You can go absolutely creative with this. Okay, hundreds of ways even. But I decided that I will look at the three modes in which missions were entangled with. Okay, let's put it that way. So trade and the forces of market and industry, colonialism, the spread of empires, and the subjugation of specific peoples, the setting up of colonies in distant lands, distant shores, and thirdly, technology. How technological advancements allowed or factored in what was technological advancements were big factors in the history of mission. So, how does mission and trade um, play together or work together? How did colonialism and mission work together? How did technology and mission work together? Basically, that's the theme of this second section here. Entanglements in the history of mission, entanglements with trade, entanglements with colonialism, and entanglements with technology. Does that make sense? Okay, so that's the kind of approach that I'm offering in this study of in the study of the history of mission in Asia. So I would like to say that this is not a comprehensive account by any stretch of imagination. I think it's absolutely impossible to do that in even in 10 hours of lecture. So this is not a comprehensive account of mission. Just one country itself, like India as a country, or say China as a country, or not to mention the Middle East, countries in the Middle East, have their own rich history. And I would encourage you, if you have the time and the interest, to pick up any of these countries and to study them, and you will learn so much. I can assure you. I have been learning about like the history of mission in the Philippines, the island of the Philippines. Absolutely interesting, absolutely mind blowing, right? To think about all that history, the complexities, and that's just Philippines. You can think about Indonesia, you can think about Japan, you can think about Korea, China. Um, yeah, you get the point, right? It's so complex. So my lecture is not a comprehensive account of mission, but it's the story of the move and the dynamics of mission in Asia, especially in how they relate with trade, colonialism, and technology. Okay, so I want to explore some regional perspectives. I'm gonna be narrowing down on some perspectives uh, as I talk about trade, colonialism, and technology. Um, yeah, so that's the kind of nexus or the kind of framework that I'm using for this discussion. Okay, so trade. Let's start with trade. Um, what is trade? Um, Trade is, I don't know what's the definition of trade, but it's the search for livelihood, to make a livelihood, to make money, to business, or to to get raw material, right? Of course, that is ultimately that will become deeply entangled with colonialism. You know that the history of colonialism, even in Africa, a large part of that was for the manufacture of raw materials, and that has to do with trade, the production of goods, production of material for the ultimate industrial production of goods, and so on and so forth, right? I want to take you all the way back to the first century, right after the resurrection of Jesus and the ascension of Jesus, after Jesus went back, uh, ascended into heaven after his resurrection. Now, we we have already read Great Commission, the Great Commission that says, go and basically preach the gospel, baptizing them and teaching them to obey from Jerusalem to Judea to Samaria and beyond, right? So obviously the epicenter, or the starting point, was Jerusalem. That was where everything climaxed and everything happened. Jerusalem was where the community of followers of Jesus Christ were first concentrated. Of course, that's not to say that that's the only place. I think there are many places where the followers of Jesus were, but they started. It began in Jerusalem. From Jerusalem, with persecution, and most importantly, with trade. People were going from Jerusalem, and you remember that the Sea of Galilee was basically, a sea means travels, right? Ships going back and forth, and there are fishermen who were going about with their trade. You remember that many of the disciples of Jesus were fishermen, sorry. And fishermen means they were going about traveling in their way of life for trade, right? For business. So I want to point out that the first journeys, the first missionaries, so to say, were tradesmen and tradeswomen. They went about in their jobs and they went about in their work from Jerusalem, and they went to Antioch. Antioch became a very important Christian center. In fact, you remember in the book of Acts, we have the record that Acts was where they were first called Christians, right? That's an important piece of information for us as well, that Antioch became an important city center for Christianity. So these were mainly traders, mainly people who were going about in their livelihood. They were going about, and as they went, they preached the gospel. They shared the gospel, the story of the gospel. If you see the trade route here, these red marks in the slideshow here, they are basically trade routes or routes. You see here that this is center, the epicenter here. We start here, right? And then they went. This is, if you follow my red mark here, this is the so-called Silk routes, right? The Silk routes, and a very important trade route that stretched all the way across the Middle East into northeast of China. And these are trade routes, and remember that there are merchants who are going about in their businesses. But as they went about in these places, they spread the gospel. They tell the gospel, the story of the gospel. Again, you see another route going here that went down into Tibet, in southwest of China. Another important trade route, another important route that pilgrims and travelers would take. Another important route that we see here is that they come down here in Arabia and take the boat here. This is an important trade route here. If you look at this one, especially from the context of India, this is an important trade route. Apparently, if the weather is good, you start from here on a ship, and if I'm not mistaken, it takes only a few weeks for the travel to go all the way to India. And so, some of you may know this, but when I heard it first, I was so surprised by this piece of news, and which was that from the first century, imagine, from the first 2,000 years back, in India, in Bombay, in present day Bombay and present day what is called Goa, Kerala, from 2,000 years back in the first century, there was already a Jewish presence. Jewish community in these places in the west coast of India. And the Jewish community was filled by uh, traders mainly, who went about in their businesses. And these traders played a really important role in telling the story of the gospel. And in fact, if you look at this slide here, it's not very clear here, but this one says Saint Thomas Christians. The tradition in India is that the prophet, not prophet, the disciple of Jesus, Thomas, the disciple of Jesus, actually came to India, and he landed on the west coast of India, and he did his ministry in the south of India. Think of this, 2000 years back, before Christianity came to England, to Scotland, or to Rome, to Italy. Back then, Rome was not a Christian empire at all. They were persecuting Christians actively then. In other words, Christianity came to India earlier than to Italy or to Rome, which means the whole idea of Christianity is a Western religion is not true. Christianity was first and foremost primarily an Asian religion. It spread to India, it spread to, can you believe it? It spread to China. Look at this map here. Nestorian monument. This was built in 780 AD, before even the 1000 year has elapsed after the death of Jesus. There was already Christian community in China. Think about that. When I heard that first, I was so thrilled to hear about these stories. Of course, the Christian community was in Mongolia as well. You may know of the famous Genghis Khan, the emperor Genghis Khan. He had Christians in his court. He had, most likely he had Christians in his family as well. His, if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to be I don't want to give false information here, but the fact is that he had Christians in his family, in his community. So the Christianity spread, and it was primarily initially a Christian religion, an Asian religion, right? It's not before it went to Europe. You know what I'm trying to say, right? You understand what I'm trying to say here. So this is important here. This is the Nestorian monument that I mentioned in 781, the one that I mentioned here. This is a picture of it. And in this inscription that was discovered in northeast of China, it talks about Christianity coming to this place and the teachings of Jesus Christ as they were preached by Nestorian missionaries. Nestorian being one of the we can call it denomination, we can call it the groups of Christianity. And this was, of course, in the Tang Dynasty in China. Sorry about the markings here, but I don't think I'll bother to erase them right now. The Tang Dynasty in China from 618 to 907 AD, they had Christian presence. It's a really significant piece of information in understanding Christianity in Asia. Okay. Now, let me see if I have covered all of that. So what I'm trying to say here is that Christianity and missions, first of all, that Christianity and missions have been a part of Asia from the beginning, from the first century, right? Christianity and mission were a part of Asian history right from the beginning. Christianity is not solely a European religion. Before it went to Europe, it was in Asia. It thrived in Asia. It grew in Asia. You may know that some of the countries like Iraq and Turkey, these were the hubs of Christianity in the first millennium, first few centuries of Christianity. Think about that for a minute. The places that you associate mostly with Islam and other religions, right? Iraq, Turkey, Armenia, these are places where Christianity thrived before it went to Europe. So let that thought sink into your mind. Christianity in Asia is a long history, it's a complex history, but we need to remember that it was, first of all, an Asian religion. Okay. All right. So let's keep going. Now, There's a lot more that we can be said. Also, I must also add that it's not just trade that spread the gospel and spread the Christians out into these places. It was also persecution. Persecution from the Roman Empire, persecution from the religious elites in Judea, as you know, that who were responsible, like Paul, right? Paul was a religious elite, and he was persecuting Christians before he encountered Jesus, and he became the missionary, and he himself was persecuted because of that faith. So because of this persecution, Christians would spread out into all these places. They would go for trade, they would be scattered, they would go as exiles, and they were taken to different places. Important point here, missions was people became missionaries wherever they went. Okay, they were, some of them were sent as missionaries, as evangelists, but most of them were just normal, ordinary Christians who were scattered because of trade or because of persecution. Okay, all right. So I need to speed up a little bit here because we've got a lot of things more to cover. So let's fast forward and come to the era. Or okay, let's before that, let me give a quick break because I think we're hitting the 1 hour mark at this point. So think about what I've said just now, and of course, some of you may know about the story of Christianity in Africa too, right? Africa's history, Africa's story with Christianity, Christianity's story in Africa also is rich and long, and and um, and very interesting. And some of you may know that story. If you do, why don't you chat about that? If you don't, why don't you just reflect on what I've told you about the history in Asia? Um, Speaking of Africa, if you look in the map here one more time, Christianity was very much, it had its presence in Cairo in Egypt, and of course Alexandria was an important city for Christianity. Ethiopia became one of the well-known Christian nation very early. Um, the Orthodox Ethiopian Church would claim that Christianity, they were one of the first earliest churches, just like India, the Thomas Christians in India. The Ethiopian Church would also claim that they also had Christianity right from the first century. That's amazing, right? It's amazing. So there's certainly the history of Christianity in Africa as well. But again, if that's not really something you are more familiar with, I would invite you to reflect on the story of Christianity in Asia too. And I'll give you take some time to stretch and to relax, or maybe to chat about this, and I will be back with the rest of the lecture for today. Let us continue with our lecture. Um, we're fast forwarding to the colonial era. We have looked at the first century where Christianity spread along with trade and tradesmen, merchants, and also people fleeing persecution. They fled to China. Some of them Christians fled to India, to Africa, to Europe, and that was how Christianity spread, in a way, kind of a byproduct of their going. Quick side note: it's very interesting that this echoes what Jesus commanded his disciples. Uh, Often I don't know how it's translated in your language, but in English, it's often translated as "Go, therefore, and preach the gospel," as though Jesus is telling us to go as missionaries. But if you look at the Greek word, the Greek uh, interpretation or Greek translation of, the Greek meaning of that passage, uh, scholars would say that it's more like as you go, preach the gospel, as you go, teach the gospel. In other words, yes, some people are sent, like go for preaching, but most of us, we are we are called to preach the gospel as we go about in our life. Like maybe you're a teacher, and as you go about in your work, do that with a sense of teaching the gospel and as a sense of mission. If you're a tradesman and you are going to other countries, as you go, uh, do the mission, preach the gospel, teach people to obey and proclaim justice and liberty for people. Or maybe if you're persecuted and you're fleeing, as we see happening in the world today, as you go, do that, like preach the gospel, tell, do your mission, right? So we see that reflected in early Christianity as they went about in the trades and merchant and work, or as they were persecuted and as they fled, they did their mission, they fulfilled their mission. Now we fast forward to more medieval and modern era, where it's marked by colonialism. Let me just give a quick filler here and say, I don't mean to say that this era is only about colonialism, but it's a substantial part of mission history. That colonialism was integrated together very closely with missionary activities. So, although I don't mean to overemphasize colonialism, I think it's important that we recognize it and we acknowledge the history of colonialism in mission. Okay, so this map is a helpful way to get a perspective of. Hang on, let me hide myself here. To give a perspective of colonialism in Asia, the orange here is British colonies. There are British colonies in 1910. Okay, the British colonies occupy all the way to Burma, as you can see here. Um, so as you can see here, they go all the way to Burma and right down to a bit of Thailand. This is Thailand here. Before it was called Siam, the Kingdom of Siam. This is French colony. What is present day Vietnam, Cambodia? All these were French colonies here. The Philippines was a colony of. First of all, it was a colony of the Spanish, but by 1910 it had become a colony of the United States of America. Okay, and I'll talk more about Philippines in a short while. You can see also here the Malay states, present day Malaysia, present day Singapore. These were all British colonies. This is a big part of Borneo and Indonesia. Indonesia was a colony of the Dutch, the Netherlands, right up till here. It's called the Dutch East Indies. So yeah, this map is a helpful way to visualize the extent of European colonial influence or control in Asia. And if you look at according to the colonies or colonization patterns, according to the patterns of colonization, mission histories are also influenced. For example, if you meet somebody from Indonesia, Dutch East Indies, right? If you meet somebody from Indonesia and they're Christians, you ask them, what is your denomination or what is your history? They will most likely point to the Dutch missions, and that is mostly Reformed, many of which were Reformed in theology. So many of them would be Reformed in theology. If you ask somebody from India, maybe from North India, it's likely that they're Christians and they have roots in Anglican theology, Anglican Christianity. Now in Northeast India, as I've shared the story is slightly different because we had American Baptists who came and did missionary work here. So because of that, our heritage is also American Baptist. If you go to Philippines, for a long time they were colonized by Spain, as I mentioned, but later on they were colonized by the U.S., as the map shows here. Before 1910, they were Spanish colony, and because of that, a majority of Filipino Christians would be Catholics, Roman Catholics. Okay, and of course, there's also a very substantial Protestant, American evangelical kind of Christianity in Philippines as well. So you understand what I'm trying to say. There's Catholics, but also Protestants in Vietnam, primarily due to the influence of France, being a French colony, but also American influence following the Vietnam War and all of that too. So yeah, it's interesting to note that you meet people from all these places, and the legacy of colonialism is very much there in the kinds of Christianity. I wonder how it is in your context. Why are you the particular denomination that you are? Maybe it has something to do with the history of colonization, and maybe it's not directly connected. But what happens is that when British are in control, it's easier for British missionaries to take an active role, and that's why the mission activities were mostly patterned according to the colonial rule in that place. If you know what I'm trying to say. All right, I want to focus in on Philippines. Do I have a map here? No, I don't. Okay, anyway, I want to focus in on the Philippines because Philippines is kind of close to my mind right now, having read something about them in the past few months. Um, this was all the way back to 1500s when the king of Spain, his name was Philip II, in mid 1500s is almost 500 years back, right? They took possession of the island of Philippines, here, and the famous or infamous traveler Magellan, he discovered, quote unquote, discovered the Philippines, and he named. Why is it called Philippines? Any guesses? It's named after the king Philip II of Spain. And in this, in the story of Philippines, it's quite interesting. Christianity was imposed. Catholic Christianity was imposed on the Filipinos. What's interesting was that the Catholic Church in the Philippines did not allow indigenous leadership. They did not allow the priests, the friars, as they say, to be Filipinos, and the locals. They were Catholic priests were shipped in from Spain, and local indigenous priests were not allowed to lead any of the congregation for a long time. And so what it means is that Christianity was a colonial enterprise. It was controlled by the colonial leaders, and it was moderated by Spanish colonial priests and clergy. And there was a massive process of extractive activities of natural resources, goods, raw material. These were all shipped out for the cause of the Spanish Empire. And the Catholic Church shared in this messy and very problematic power. They shared in the power with the state and the empire. So Christianity became a colonial way of life in Philippines. And when this revolution, even within the church, when there were priests and all have revolutions, it was often geared against Christianity, because Christianity is understood as part and parcel of the colonial regime. You understand what I mean? So mission became a way of subjugating the people of the Philippines. So I'm trying to draw here the role of mission in and colonialism in Philippines. Okay, a mission became a way of subjugating and controlling the people. Of course, what happened was the Philippines was eventually sold off to the U.S. for some dollars, some amount of money, it was sold off to the U.S. And there was, of course, a long conflict of war of independence against the U.S. as well. But even today, the U.S. Army, the U.S. military continues to have a presence in the Philippines. Again, still the colonial legacy still remains. But anyway, that's a side topic. Now, so what I'm trying to say is in the Philippines, mission was seen as the colonial apparatus. Now, let's go back to the situation here in the northeast part of India. In the northeast India, among the Naga tribes, missionaries were not seen as part of the colonizers, because you remember the missionaries were American Baptists, and often American Baptist missionaries did not agree with British colonizers, the British leaders. Often the British colonizers would make things difficult for them to do their mission work, and often it was the after the independence from British in 1947, it was the West American Baptist missions who supported their their sentiments for freedom. It's a long story, but what I'm trying to say here is that in India, among the Northeast Indian Naga Indians, the Naga Christians, mission was not seen as colonization. Mission was seen as almost liberation. You see that in the case of Korea as well, right? In Korea, who were the colonizers? The colonizers were Japanese Empire, the Japanese Empire, who actively tried to colonize Korea, right? The colonizers were Japanese people who were not Christians. They were Shinto or their own traditional religions. The colonizers were seen as the Chinese were seen as colonizers. They're not Christians, and so in that scenario, Christianity was seen as an apparatus of liberation. Christianity was understood as a way of resisting all of these colonizing factors of Japan and China. You know what I'm trying to say here? So you see the case of Philippines and India and Korea, you realize that the colonization and Christianity, yes, they're deeply entangled, but it's more complex than simply saying, oh, Christianity and colonizing, it's a religion of colonization. That's it, finished. It's not as simple as that. Christianity plays different roles in different places. Yes, it had its role in colonization, as I understand the case to be in Africa as well, and in other parts of India as well. But not so for the Naga Christians, not so for the Koreans, who see Christianity as never associated with colonization. You know what I mean? I think there are certain theological reasons for that. I think it's because Christianity is deeply translatable, and for this I have to thank the African theologian Lamin Sana, who have popularized, or who have helped us to see Christianity as a translation, a process of translation when Christianity becomes incorporated in a specific place. Christianity became the mode of indigenization among the Nagas, a way of incorporating their traditional ways of life and giving life to the traditional ways of life. So in the case of Nagas and in the case of Koreans, Christianity became the choice when they were faced with existential crisis, political crisis, military crisis, economic crisis. Christianity became the source of meaning and the source of translated a force and energy for their communities, right? So in this quick section, my intention has been to point out to you the messy messy historical legacy of mission and its entanglements with colonization, and I may just add this westernization as well. So it's a fact that mission and Christianity has been entangled with colonization and westernization, and we have seen that in the history of colonization in Philippines, even in among the Nagas or in Korea, and the messy entanglements of mission with colonization, with westernization, is definitely a fact. But again, I want to point out that Christianity was never, in the first place, was never a Western religion. And if anything, the fact that it has become associated with Western culture is very, very unfortunate. It's a tragedy, and I think it's something that we as non-Westerners, like you in Africa, me as an Asian, somebody from India, we need to resist that. We need to show that Christianity is not a Western religion. It is very much a religion for the Africans, that belongs to the Africans. It's very much a religion that belongs to us as Nagas or Asians, or yes, for Europeans as well. It's something that we can claim and belongs to us as a faith, because it is about God who created all races, all tribes and tongues or languages, right? So yes, okay. So I'm a bit going to an aside there, but my second section here has been to bring to your attention the entanglements of Christianity and mission with colonialism. Okay, a quick break. I want you to discuss this with your friends and your colleagues, and yeah, I don't know what you're going to discuss, but just discuss about colonialism and its entanglements with mission and Christianity. Maybe from your own context, you have some stories you want to share. Uh, Go ahead and take some time, and 5 minutes, since we're running a bit short with time today. 5 minutes, and then we'll continue. All right, let us continue with the lecture. We have looked at um, we have looked at trade. We have looked at um, colonialism, colonization, and thirdly, we're looking at technology and migration. I'm going to be quite quick here. I think there's well, we can say a lot, but I think I will be very brief here because I think the point is quite self-explanatory. My point here is that technology in general has opened up opportunities for people to migrate, people to build networks and connections across boundaries, across geographies, across cultures, right? For example, look at what's going on here right now. I'm from India. I would have never ever met uh, some of you or any of you, right? I don't know. There might be a chance in the future, but it's very unlikely that without this technology, this interaction and this relationship could have ever happened, right? We are able to connect like this, and you are able to hear me. And during our conversations, during our discussion, uh, we are enabled to talk with one another, to text one another, and I think that's amazing. That's technology that has allowed this kind of exchange of ideas, exchange of thoughts, and connections and networks to be formed, right? And so that's really what I'm saying here. Technology has opened up opportunities for connections, for migration, for mobility, indeed for missions and for trade as well, right? These days, Facebook or social media have become a very important platform for doing for dissemination of information, and part of that also, of course, the mission activities. It's a very important forum for engaging with people, and you can be in one place and the other person can be in another place, and you can have um, a conversation about life, about mission, about religion, right? So technology has opened up that opportunity for us, and I think it's important to recognize that, and how has that allowed mission to be played out in our lives today, right? So uh, another example that I can give you from my own experience is that I'm not a Chinese. I'm from India. I speak Hindi. Um, uh, I I watch Hindi movies. I think some of you might watch. Like I understand that Hindi movies are pretty popular in Africa. So I'm properly like from. I grew up in India. I read Hindi. I studied Sanskrit. I studied Indian history. Nothing about China. Okay. The first Chinese I met was when I was 21 years old, and now I'm in Edinburgh. Um, I'm pastoring the English congregation of a Chinese church. Thankfully, I don't have to speak Chinese because I take care of the English congregation. But think about how crazy that is, right? Somebody from India who comes to the UK in Scotland and ends up ministering to a Chinese congregation living in Edinburgh, right? That is the reality of the 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 kind of interconnected lives that we live here in the 21st century because of technology, because of opportunities to travel, because of flights, right? Because of airplanes, because of networks that allow this kind of mobility to take place. So, technology and migration is an absolutely important reality, absolutely important part of our 21st century. Technology, of course, mass media. Um, it's very possible that some of maybe you or maybe your young people in your congregation or in your family are listening to the same type of music that people are listening to in Northeast India. It's very possible, right? You, I quickly mentioned Mission Impossible in the first lecture. It's very possible that you know that movie, and even though we live in such different worlds, we are watching the same kind of content. We have the same mass media that's produced, and we are interconnected in that way. Social media, of course, allows us to connect seamlessly without any issue, like for free in a way, as long as you have the connection. Yeah, also, of course, this allows the transportation, the mobility of ideas, theological ideas, from one place, of the world to another place. I can be sitting here in Edinburgh in Scotland and telling you all this, and you are hopefully you're listening to this and you are learning, and I also look forward to learn from you in your conversation. So there's mobility of ideas and teachings, and also negatively, what has happened is that some of the debates that happen, let's say in the U.S., gets picked up, and although it's not an issue for, so I've seen this in India, in Northeast India. Um, some of the debates that's happening in the U.S. are picked up by Christians, theologians, and they want to have the same kind of debate, even though it's not as relevant. There are other relevant issues that can be talked about, and yet um, the contentions, the sectarian kinds of arguments and debates are also communicated, are also transferred from place to another. Maybe think about your own context. Maybe is there a discussion or is there a debate that that is picked up from the U.S. or from the U.K. or whatever it may be, that has no relevance for everyday life, but it's something that theologians love to argue. Um, I can think of a number of such examples in my own context, and I wonder if you can think of that. And I intend to uh, invite you to question that. Why is it important? These are arguments that Americans or British people are having in their own context for whatever reasons. Maybe legitimate questions, debates they're having. It may be illegitimate, but whatever it may be, why are we picking that up, and why are we having the same kind of disagreements and same kind of rivalries to divide us, right? And theological contentions that are happening in U.S. have also affected us in our churches. Why are we doing that? Yes, we appreciate the fact that teachings and ideas can also pass borders, but we also must be aware that divisions do not get transferred across borders. We need to make sure that we are actively and intentionally thinking about all of this as we live in a very interconnected world. With the good things that are transferred, there are also not so great things, and we need to make sure that we're not swayed by what's happening in wherever, right? So this raises another question of mission, the effects of technology on mission. Um, in one sense, technology has opened up the avenues for mission. In another sense, it continues to propagate the dynamics of power in mission as well. Um, Let me give you an example. Um, when somebody recommends a book on a certain topic, who do you recommend? Do you find yourself always recommending American writers, British writers, intelligent, like educated writers? Or do you ever say something like, oh, talk to your pastor, go talk to your local leaders? Why is it that the authority and the power of theological, the theological authority and theological power is always invested somewhere in the West or in America or in Australia or in India, wherever it may be, right? Why is there still an inequality in the dynamics of how who listens to what, who listens to who? Why is it always Indians and people in Northeast India, tribals, who are always listening to American preachers and American pastors, never the reverse? Why can we ever imagine or dream of a day when we all listen to one another, right? So this raised an important issue, important question in how technology affects mission. Can technology affect or bring about an equality in mission and in theology, in Christianity? Can we listen to one another? The truth is, at this point, the ones with money, the ones with power, the ones with influence are always located in the West right now. And whatever they say is understood as authority. And that, I think that is a huge problem that we need to recognize. I'm not saying that we should be critical of everything, But I am saying that we must be intentional about what we receive as authority, and I am saying that we need to respect our own voices, even though it's not coming from fancy, um, like lavishly done websites and beautiful videography, because we simply don't have the resource to do all of that. We don't have the resource to publish in big grand books and all that, and yet we must recognize that that doesn't legitimize, or that is not the source of authority in our Christian faith. Our source of authority is truth. Our source of authority is God Himself. And so I want to empower you as well as we think about this. Technology has, yes, opened up opportunities for us to learn and to communicate, to put our voice out there, but make sure that you don't give in to the power dynamics that comes in the age of technology. The loudest, the, the richest, the most powerful. Um, Christianity, Jesus Christ teaches us to be humble. Jesus Christ teaches us to listen to to those who are not in authority, to learn to sit down with those who are oppressed, to learn to have a conversation with, just like He did with the Samaritan woman. Um, that is the paradigm that we have here. So, as we think about technology and as we think about social media, uh, I want to also raise this issue and invite you to think intentionally about who we listen to as a church, or as congregation, as ministry, as people in ministry, and who do we prioritize? Do we prioritize only the flashy and the powerful and the glamorous, or do we prioritize the voices of everyone? Because I believe that everybody has a story to tell. Everybody has a witness to proclaim. Okay, so but yeah, also about migration, technology and migration. Migration is an important aspect of 21st century. You may be surprised to hear that one of the biggest Christian influence in London, in the UK right now, are are coming from African churches in London, in the UK. Some of the biggest churches in London, in the UK, are African churches, churches that with African population. And increasing church presence is the Chinese Christians. As you know, as I mentioned, I'm working in one of them. Um, yeah, it's just amazing how migration has allowed all of this mixing and mobility of people, and with that, the Western society, British society, that you might imagine is a Christian society and all of that. The major Christian presence in the Western society today is non-Europeans, Chinese, Africans, Indians, right? So that's something for you to think about as we have reflected really briefly on technology and migration. This has allowed peoples to move and to exchange ideas and thoughts. Uh, yes, there's a danger that it still continues to promote the same kind of equality, but also I think it has given opportunities for different kinds of dynamics, different kinds of missions, and different kinds of Christianities to grow and to make its presence felt, and to teach one another, to learn from one another. Okay, so let me pause there for 2 minutes, and I want again to invite you to reflect on those in your group, in your with your peers, or the moderator in your group can lead the discussion. And I'll be back after 5 minutes. 2 minutes, sorry, 3 minutes. All right, we are on the third section of today's lecture, and I'm going to be really, really quick here because our time is running out as well. So, the third part is a theological reflection on missions in Asia. So, reflecting on some of the things that I've shared in the first two section, and just reflecting them very briefly. First of all, the question is, do we need a theology of the death and demise of Christianity? Because the fact is that Christianity rises and Christianity dies, right? Christianity, there's a time for Christianity to rise and a time for Christianity to fade out. For example, in Iraq, this is this is called Saint Elijah's Monastery near Mosul in Iraq. This was the year 2009. And apparently 2014, the Islamic ISIS group has already completely demolished this site. It's all gone. And this temple was likely built in the 4th century, is it? In the 6th century AD. So that's 780 something. Really early, right? Really early. That would be about 1300 years ago. That's 1300 years ago, right? That's crazy, right? 700 600 6th century AD, and this monastery was built and it's gone. This is a testament to the fact that Christianity existed before 6th century AD in Iraq. The tradition is that Thomas the Apostle, or Thaddeus, was the one who brought Christianity in this area. It thrived starting from the 1st century AD, in other words, before 99 AD. It was in northern Iraq, in Assyria, and all these places in present-day Turkey. It thrived, it grew, it survived, and up till the 7th century, when there was the Islamic Muslim invasion, when Christianity slowly and gradually was wiped out by the Arabs. So the fact remains that Christianity was thriving in these places, in Iraq, in Turkey. Turkey is another example. The Christian presence in Turkey is much lower than what it used to be in the past. So the reality is that there's a death of Christianity in different places. And we are seeing somewhat similar trends in Europe as well, where beautiful cathedrals made as churches, are now being transformed as pubs, as restaurants, as museums, where there's no more worship going on. So yes, it keeps us, it's kind of sad to see this, but I think the reality is that Christianity rises and Christianity also dies in certain places. I wonder if you can think about that for a minute, and if there's anything theological that we can think about it, and we can think about. I think, for one, it keeps the church humble. It keeps us from being triumphalistic and thinking that we are the church, we have done this, and we're going to go on from strength to strength, and we're never going to die out, all of that, right? It keeps us from being triumphant and being overly confident in ourselves, that we are the church, we know what we're going to do. Instead of that, it's better to be humble. It's better to realize that in history there have been churches that have thrived, that have grown, and also have declined. For example, the Constantinople in present-day Istanbul in Turkey, that was the heart of the Eastern Church. They were a church that was tied together with empire, with the Byzantine Empire. At their hub, they were one of the strongest empire in the world. Triumphalistic in many sense. Now, if you look at Constantinople, if you look at Istanbul, it's nowhere to be seen. The buildings are still there, but that kind of Christian kind of empire is nowhere to be seen. So yes, first of all, it keeps the church humble to remember that churches The mission is God's mission. It's not the church's mission. It's not the church that runs mission. Rather, it is God that runs the mission. And as long as we are in obedience to God, I think we can continue to thrive and do well. But the moment we lose sight of the fact that this is God's work, this is God's mission, this is God's church, I think it's very easy to slip into this kind of triumphalism and decline, if you can say so. Also, I think it keeps noticing that church rises and decline helps us to see that the gospel needs to be needs to needs to be updated, and it needs to be refreshed in certain contexts in different applications. So the role for us as Christians in the 21st century is to assess and see what God is doing in the world, and to see how different peoples are uh, articulating the gospel in fresh ways. Like think about Africa, like think about China. How are Christians obeying God there? How are Christians uh, uh, doing activities of mission there? How are they telling the story, right? Gone are the days when the standard formula of theology used to be books and books and books and books, as it was in Europe. Now there's a growing recognition that Christianity is also articulated in the forms of songs, as of dances, of practices, right? So these are all different ways in which the the church is realizing with every generation that there are fresh and updated ways in which the gospel can be articulated, that Christianity can be practiced in fresh and different ways, as you may also know very well, right, in your own context. Um, so yeah, that also calls for humility. That also calls us to listen to one another. How are you guys in Africa living out your faith? How are we in the Naga Hills living out our faith? And we need to listen to one another to make sure that we are listening to what God is doing in this world. Because again, this is God's mission. It's not my mission. It's not your church mission. It's not Africans' mission. It's not Asians' mission. It's not Europeans' mission. It's God's mission, right? So we need to listen to one another. No one is ahead in this. It's not like American societies are ahead and we need to always be listening to them. Yes, there was a time when that was probably effective, but we need to realize now that we need to be listening to God, and we need to be listening to what God is doing. And if God is doing something in Africa, I need to listen to you guys. If God is doing something in China, I need to be listening to those guys. And we need to be mutually listening to one another instead of setting ourselves up as superior or inferior and all of that power dynamics, right? In the kingdom of God and in the mission of God, God is freely and generously moving, and we need also to be generous as we listen to one another and as we work together in the mission. We need friends. We need friends. We don't need employers and employees. We don't need bosses and workers. We need friends who work together in this mission. Okay. So that's some reflection from a theology of death, the theology of the death of the church. The death of the church shows us, the reality of the death of the church shows us that we cannot be triumphant, we cannot be arrogant. And I'm not saying, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that the churches in Iraq were arrogant. No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that God is doing something in this world, and we need to listen. When something rises and something falls, it's not the end of the world. God is still moving and God is still working, right? Okay, so that's the first reflection. The second reflection is related, and it has to do with methodological issues. I mentioned this very briefly. There was a time when people thought theology is about books, about ideas and doctrines. No doubt those are important, but more and more people are realizing that theology is also embedded in songs, in dances, in your practices, in what you do when you gather together to celebrate festivals. Christianity and theology and mission is incorporated in everything that we do. It's not just books and preaching and evangelism. I've mentioned this in the 5 paradigms as well. It involves evangelism, yes, but it also involves formation. It involves compassion, it involves justice, and it involves creation care. You cannot preach for creation care. You have to do, you have to act, you have to write stories, you have to write books, you have to study hard. So mission takes on a very colorful and very diverse methodological uh, image, right? It's not just one person going with the Bible and books and preaching vocally to a group of people. Mission has been expanded, and mission has been, how do I put it? Mission has been, the walls have been broken. Mission is released into the world to all of us, not just to the priests, not just to the ministers, not just to pastors and missionaries. Mission of God has been released to all of us, and we have a part to play. So methodological issues, um, it's time to move away from the idea that the rational, the cognitive, Western way of thinking, theologizing, and expressing our faith experience. That's the only. It's time to stop thinking that those are the only way. I must emphasize those are very important, but also we need to reclaim the fact that the imagination, the artistic, the symbolic, the creative forces of my Asian peoples and African peoples, right? I remember one theologian, I think he's Catholic theologian, but he's such an important theologian in my studies, Emmanuel Katongole. He talks about the social imagination of using art and narratives in order to communicate, in order to articulate Christian faith. And I think that's such an important part of our role as of people in mission, that we need to move away from the idea that there's one way of doing things and that's the only way. I think the walls have been broken. We are the community of God's people, and we must do what we can, how God has gifted us in whatever ways to continue to move into mission. The next thing that I want to talk about is, so this is a quotation by a theologian from the Philippines. His name is Jojo Fong. He says, the time has come to move from the rational, cognitive, Western model of theologizing and expressing of our faith experiences and reclaim the intuitive, imaginative, artistic, symbolic, and creative forces of Asian indigenous peoples in an embodied, non-dualistic, and non-dominating way. Non-dualistic, take note of these three, and let me just emphasize this, okay? In an embodied, right, and non-dualistic, and non-dominating ways. So important, so important. Such a great quote for us to. Sorry, I'm covering this again. So see that again. In an embodied, non-dualistic, and non-dominating ways. Such an important sentence right there. So again, many things that we can say from there, but I'll quickly move on to the next point. The socioeconomic issues we need to think about. Christianity as an Asian religion, yes, in light of poverty, in light of ecological dysfunction, in light of political problems in this world, we need to engage with all these issues that we are facing in our contemporary realities. We need to think about. See, these are the questions that I want to leave you with. What might mission look like in a context of poverty? What does mission look like in a context where our environment is being abused and exploited for monetary gains, where trees are being cut, and where climate change is affecting our lives directly? What does mission look like in that context? What does mission look like in a time when there's like massive divide between the rich and the poor, when there's poor people who are struggling to meet their basic needs and rich people who are living in opulence? What does mission look like in that context? What does mission look like in a context where governments and people in authority and power are corrupted and they think only about the gain, it seems? What does mission look like? So these are questions, socio-economic and political issues that mission must engage, right? Remember what Jesus said. God, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, and He has anointed me to proclaim liberty to the captives, healing to the poor. What might that mission look like in your context, filled likely filled with socioeconomic issues, like in my context. All right. So I think I had some few more things to say, but I'll keep that for the next lecture. Okay. So I think that's all the time we have. Um, I I believe we have a few 5 minutes something. I want you to just take this time to just reflect on some of these things that we have shared. Um, um, if it helps, I'm gonna just go back to the themes that we talked about. Theology of death, methodological reflection. I'm gonna leave this page on so that you can reflect on them for the next whatever few minutes that we have still left. Okay, so thank you for your attention. May God give us wisdom to think about these things and to have the generosity to think critically for His mission, for the sake of His mission, and for the sake of His church. Amen.